Welcome, Kristina Hallett. I'm so excited to have you here with us today. And I'm so excited to introduce you to my audience because you are a force to be reckoned with, and you just have such an amazing spirit and so much brilliance and beauty and power to share with the world. And it's an honor to have you here.
Thank you, Nicole. That was one of the nicest introductions I've ever had. I really appreciate it. And you
Absolutely.
must know how I feel absolutely the same about you. And I know that your listeners do too. So thanks for giving me this chance to talk with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. It's definitely an honor. And I want to start out with how I first came to know of you and what really had me leaning in from a personal perspective. And that is, we have something in common. We both have an experience. And I think that's a great place to begin. So, why don't you share that with my listeners rather than me share it? If you can tell us how you caught my attention, that would be amazing.
I am so happy to do that. In 2003, I went to prison. And while there, I met my future husband. Actually, he was the deputy warden, and I was the director of psychological services for the largest men's prison in our state.
Yeah, it's awesome. And it's funny because I never even thought about the impact of somebody hearing that until I heard it from you in that way, because I talk about, from time to time, I'll say something about, when I was in prison or when I was in jail, and it's like,
Yes.
what? People are like, huh? Huh? And I'm like, oh, right. Yeah, no, I wasn't an inmate. I was an officer, but
Exactly, right? And I noticed years ago, the first time I said something about, oh, when I was in prison, and people just looked at me like, what are you talking about? And then it struck me, and I said, well, yeah, that's where I met my husband. And every single person immediately thought, okay, A, I think I'm scared. Like, who is this woman? And B, why is she sharing this? Like, shouldn't she be ashamed and keeping this on the down low? And three, you met your husband? Like, how did that even happen? And I would just start laughing before they even had a chance to say anything, because that's exactly what happened. I went to prison and I met the man who became my husband, and it was fabulous. No, he wasn't an inmate, and neither was I.
that's awesome. And something else you talked about when I saw you speaking on stage was it really like triggered me inside, because, and maybe this is why it just rolls off my tongue, like, well, when I was in jail or when I was in prison, um, because it really is. You are really in there, even if you're even if you are an officer or in the medical department or what have you. Because, or at least for us, I can speak for as an officer, because I think at least where I've worked in the past, medical staff has shorter shifts. They can leave. They can wander around the building at will, and we couldn't. Like, we would be, I was at one facility, no, I guess all of them really, where we would be locked in with the inmates.
You had a
They would have
post, right?
yard.
Yeah.
Yeah, and but when they were out of their cells even, right? And so I'm in Canada, we don't carry guns here. And so it can be a sticky and freaky situation. And you were talking about prisoner movement, and you're a speaker, and I just love how you put it all together so eloquently. So I don't even know. I don't want to give it away or what have you. So I think if you can just kind of tell my listeners that part of your speech where you're recounting the experience of coming across a prisoner and your recognition and realization in that moment, that will kind of bring us up to closer to where we are today.
Okay. My pleasure. So I started off actually describing what it's like to be in a trap. And that was the name that we use for it. And I think that's part of what you're talking about because a trap is a section of the prison where there are doors on either side. And in this case, it was usually about a 12 by 12-foot square, and the doors were locked. And usually, you, as the individual, worker, or inmate, were not the person who was in charge of opening them, either for you to go in or for you to leave. So once you were in there, you were in there. Interestingly, very similar. I didn't say this at the time, but it's very similar to a locked inpatient psychiatric unit, right? Only the difference is on a psychiatric unit, everybody who's working there pretty much has keys to get in and out. And that's very different than when you're working in a correctional institution. So, what I talked about was really taking people on this journey of walking into the first trap and seeing what it was like and realizing for the first time I didn't have any freedom. I wasn't in charge. And this was literally, I was talking about my very first day on the job. And I thought, wow, I took this job. And yet I already am feeling like I'm losing some of the basic respect and dignity that I take for granted out in the real world. And as I continued on, literally going into facility, we had to go through several more sections that were similar to that. One was a long hallway, but in essence, it was similar to a trap, just happened to be a longer one. And then as we moved into the third trap, I moved in, the gate closed behind me, and out of nowhere, a voice says, "Where are you going?" Now, I didn't know that there were these officers in a little section right next to me. So I'm sort of looking around like, is this the voice of God? Like, what's happening right here? And as I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to say and how I'm going to, like, nobody knows me. It's my first day. And what happens is that the door in front of me opens, and an officer comes in. And with him is a man in cuffs and shackles. And they come into this same space with me, and the door automatically closes behind them. I'm looking at the two of them, sort of still freaked out. Like, I haven't even answered the question about where I'm going. And the officer is saying something on his radio and at the same time looking at his watch. So he doesn't see me at all. And this man in cuffs and shackles looks at me and he just leers. Now, this is a men's prison. I don't really know what I'm doing. And all of a sudden I thought, oh God, did I make the biggest mistake of my life? What have I done? Because I was a single mom. Like, there was me raising my daughter. And at the time, she was about 9. So I'm like, okay, great. I'm locked. I can't do anything. I don't know what I'm doing. Someone's in cuffs and shackles. They're leering at me, and I don't know what happens next. And the biggest thing that happened for me in that moment, and I continued to have these experiences over the time that I worked there, was that I noticed that instantly I was viewing the entire situation as a threat and the other person, this inmate, as a threat. And then I went beyond that into there's me, sort of the good guy, and there's them, which is the inmate and the officer, and they're not the good guys. Like, they're the threat, I'm the good guy, and I don't feel connected to any of this. And it strikes me right away that what is going on? I don't know these people. I don't know anything about them. I mean, I don't know why the guys in cuffs and shackles, right? So you have a million thoughts flooding your brain all at the same time. So on the one hand, I'm like, oh, should I be afraid? On the other hand, I'm like, I'm trapped. I'll never get out. Like, goodbye, daughter dear. I love you. And on another hand, I'm thinking, these are humans. Like, I am jumping to a conclusion. And it becomes so obvious to me in that moment that I've jumped to this assumption about I'm on one side and they're on another. And I totally lost that thread of common humanity between us. And so the next wave, sort of a feeling that came in was, we're all humans here. Like, we all have the same nervous system. We all have the same emotions, feelings. Like, we're not different. I mean, obviously we're different, but at the core, we're human beings. And I knew I had a choice. I knew that I could sort of stay stuck in that us and them, this isn't okay, something's wrong with them, and stay separate. Or I could really open myself up to being compassionate and connected through this common bond of humanity. And it was truly this life changing experience for me because as that happened, I became very clear how I wanted to conduct myself throughout the time that I worked in corrections. And you know, maybe some of your listeners know this, but I bet a lot of people don't know that there's often a sense in different jails and prisons that people have to have not just strict boundaries, but almost this veneer, this tough person sort of veneer, and that there's a concern about people being too caring or too compassionate. And there's also what I have seen a lot is a sense of disrespect. Now, that's not across the board, but I think that often people are not necessarily treated with respect and dignity. And I'm a person who loves to smile. So literally I made as the the door opened and I went through, this is the part of the story you didn't get to hear, and I got to exit out and make my way to my new office. Never actually ever being in charge of keys, so I never opened a whole door. Someone else was always doing that for me. But I made the decision, and it was an active decision, that I was going to greet people and treat people in prison the same way I did in the world. So if I'm walking down the street, and it doesn't matter if it's 11 a.m. or 11 p.m., if I'm passing by someone, I look at them and I say, hi, or how are you? And I do that wherever I am. And I did the same thing throughout the time that I worked in corrections, whether it was supermax or medium, whether I was in segregation or out in general population. And that's how I became to be known was that, oh yeah, there's the doc. I always had a little notebook so I could write down people's concerns and I'd walk by and say, hey, how's it going? How are you doing? And there were quite a number of officers who pulled me aside and said, don't do that. You're going to get a reputation of being all sorts of things, quite sort of, a person who doesn't have good boundaries. I'll just leave it at that. I won't use any of the other words. Uh, or people will think they can take advantage of you. And my response, and this was literally through to my core, it's part of my core values. My response was, no, you know what? I'm going to treat people as human beings. So there's people who've done a lot of crappy things in this world. And that does not mean I'm okay with it. Like, I have pretty strong feelings about things that are okay and not okay. But by the same token, they're still humans. And then it got tested. And here's the teaser for you. It got tested because while I was working there, my state ultimately had an inmate who chose to proceed towards execution. And I was involved in that process from start to finish.
Yeah. You know, I really appreciate you sharing the experience, and I just want to comment on a few of those things from my own perspective, which is a little bit different from yours because of my position, and it was different than yours. But we have a lot of similar feelings as well. When I first quit my job in corrections and started my online business and I would be on podcasts. That's what everybody wanted stories about. And I think that, you know, it's really glorified in the media and in the, not in the media, but in the TV and movies. It's glorified what it's like inside. And in the news, officers are vilified. And people are always looking for, you know, what what the folks on the thin blue line do wrong and how we're abusing, you know, everybody. And while I agree very, very strongly that it's really hard inside to be kind and to be good and to treat people as people because of the culture and the overall, and of course this isn't everywhere. I worked in an excellent facility that was a supermax, and then I worked in a bucket, which was they call the bucket. It's more of a jail, and we had both maximum security. I say that with quotes, maximum security and minimum, not minimum, medium security detainees. It was a detention center.
Mm,
It's been a while. It's hard to remember the words.
right.
um,
There's specific lingo for all of that, right?
Specific lingo,
Yeah.
yes. Just like the gates are controlled by control, which
Right.
is often outside of that area and in a central location which has steel doors and bulletproof glass all around it. And these one or two officers are monitoring multiple areas at the same time and controlling things with buttons that are computerized, and it's very easy to make mistakes. And oftentimes between the doors, when people are moving um, and they're locked into small areas, if if you don't have a very solid staff, it's very easy for break for big fights and assaults to happen
Right.
in those areas.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on. And for me, when people would ask these questions, like wanting the stories, and it's like that's not something that you don't want to know. Like,
Right.
so just watch the movies and watch the TV, and you can believe all that, because inside there are real things that are dealt with, and there are real and horrific things that you see, and especially at night, when when the majority of the staff is out. And I consistently worked night shifts for many years, so it's a very strange place. And the mentality of the officers, again, if you don't have a solid leadership, if you don't have a solid um, super high ethics group working, um, things can get very ugly. And that was my experience. And when I left the bucket after about just over a year of being there, I had I had like gotten so sick, and I had lost so much of myself because I couldn't be myself. And so when I came into corrections and youth justice in Ontario, I had come from a space that was innovative, and it was an alternative to incarceration for young offenders, male young offenders. So once they were sentenced, they could go to an alternative facility, and it was based on a positive peer culture, based on the work of Harry Vorath. And it was all about teaching the young men to be young men, treating them with respect, and teaching them how to teach themselves, treat themselves with respect, treat others with respect, treat authority. And it was an amazing program. And I, came from that into a whole different world where people did not believe it was possible or should happen to treat, or to speak to think of, to interact with them, as you said, us and them, right? So them in a respectful way. And something that I always held to and would speak up of, no matter how horrible officers were to me, because if you're a fire starter, if you don't toe the line, um, it's my position here is not as a judge. That is not my
Right.
job. I'm not God, and I'm not a judge. I am here to ensure health, safety, and welfare. That is my role. Anything above and beyond that, if I can support rehabilitation, if I can support reintegration, if I can show somebody compassion, then that's a bonus. But I will uphold my responsibilities to provide and ensure health, safety, and welfare all the time, no matter how heinous the crime, no matter how heinous the behavior. That's my role. And So yeah, I appreciate, I know this is your interview, but I think I really appreciate getting to share this also with my listeners, because many people over the years have wanted those stories. And I interviewed a few years back Mike Pashota, and he and I talked a little bit about what life in prison is like. He did 10 years, and now he's passionate about getting inmates the message that you can change your life in here, and you can go out and have a successful life and all of that stuff. And there are a number of former inmates who now speak around the world and are inspiring, but they're very, very, very far and few between. So thank you for opening up this dialogue for me and for my listeners.
Oh, I'm so happy to. And I really appreciate that you've mentioned this idea about how people imagine things are and what it's really like. And that was all part of my learning experience. I had previously worked in the community with youth gang members and adjudicated youth offenders. So I'd worked in residential, out in the community. So when I entered into prison, sort of my thought was like, oh, it's sort of going to be like working with these teens, just like an older version of these teens. And by and large, it sort of was, except that there were some people who'd been incarcerated for a really long time. There were some people who wanted to ensure that they stayed incarcerated so that they were not committed to the health and safety of anyone else. This is on an inmate perspective. And then there were the vast majority of people who were there and they were either in a neutral place or maybe a stagnant place or starting to make strides to change things around in their life. And so it was the whole microcosm. And the same thing is true for the officers. And I do want to clarify what I said because by and large, the vast majority
Yeah.
of officers that I worked with were absolutely decent, reasonable, kind human beings. And what they were dedicated to is exactly what you said: health, safety, and welfare. You have to follow the rules. There's good reason for the rules. And truthfully, so I've run children's inpatient psychiatric units. I've been on adult psychiatric units because I'm a psychologist. And then I've also done this corrections work and street work, all of this. And I always truthfully felt much safer in a prison than I did in any other psychiatric place. And I think that's really worth mentioning because that speaks to the degree of commitment that I saw every officer at every level have to maintaining a safe and secure environment. So,
Yeah.
like that for me was part of my experience.
And I just
Also,
want to also
oh, go,
jump in there to
yeah.
say the vast, vast majority of officers that I have worked with or have known outside of my places um, are great, are honest, are hardworking, are all of the stuff. I happen to be in a facility that was where people who didn't fit into the standards of where what they should and had things against them, there the bucket is where they kind of sent all of them, the management and the officers who couldn't do well in other places. There's a very big contingent of them in this place, and it definitely, that place, that one place is I do not I cannot say is good in any way, shape, or form,
Yeah.
but and everywhere else I've been, absolutely. So I definitely just want to make sure I'm also with you on that.
Yeah. I ultimately, I mean, as I said, I ended up marrying the deputy warden. So, I had a lot of respect for the work he did and the way that he managed the operations of the facility and really the values. But that didn't mean that everybody was living them all the time. So there were, an example is that there were people who would use um, really unkind words and names to refer to certain segments of the inmate population or to individuals. And so that was one of the places where I felt like it wasn't okay. So there was this funny confluence of who I am as a human being and a psychologist and my values. And then the fact that I was there, but I was there as the director of psychological services. I was not there as an officer. And so I'd say, it's not okay to talk about someone that way, or that's not okay to use those names. And literally, people would look at me and they would say some version of, know your place. And I'm like, oh, I do know my place. I'm a human being. And like, this is what we do. This is how we deal with other human beings. You don't have to. You don't have to give someone a pass on their behavior. I mean, absolutely, hold them accountable. That's how everyone. That's how I feel so safe, and I held people accountable as well. But we also have a choice in how we see people and what we do. And is it okay if I bring in a little bit about the execution? Not
Oh,
the
yes.
actual, but the thing. Okay, so it
Yeah,
was a
definitely.
yeah. So there's so much about this. Um, really, that it's a from a variety of different perspectives. It's just a fascinating story. So usually, eh, I'm not in a state where there's commonly executions. There hadn't been one for decades. But usually in a state, if someone had the death penalty, what happens is someone goes through whatever series of mandatory appeals that there are, and then at the end of that, their sentence may be carried through. And the way that it occurred, though, in this state was that most people, once they finished their mandatory appeals, would continue to make voluntary appeals so that the case would just keep dragging out. And every time there was a voluntary appeal, there was also another court appearance, and then that would involve all of the families of the victims and the associated people. So it was just kept going and going and going. So, in essence, um, the mandatory appeal process is about a 20-year process. And at the end of that, this particular individual was a serial rapist murderer. And, that was not something that I was sort of okay with whatsoever. Particularly, I just told you I was a single mom of a young girl. Like, there was nothing in my mind that was okay about this conceptually. But I also was then working individually with this individual and got a sense to see who that person was. And then I was supporting all of the other people around this individual. So the officers who really wished that he had died a long time ago, and the officers who didn't want to see a death penalty enacted, as well as family members, clergy, like pretty much if you think about the entire possible circle of people, those were people that I was interacting with as part of my role and this liaison with mental health and custody related issues. But what made this particularly so interesting was, so this person said, okay, I'm done with my mandatory appeals, just go ahead and do it. And that caused a whole host of court appearances and filings because there were all sorts of people who were basically saying this is someone with death row syndrome, or this is someone who's trying to commit state assisted suicide, or all sorts of different reasons that people had. So what it boiled down to, and this is the part that I think is so interesting, what it boiled down to was this individual competent for the sentence to be carried out? And competency is a legal term, but basically, do you know what you're doing? Do you know what's right and wrong? And are you able to make an informed decision? The individual talked about having developed a set of spiritual beliefs, and in essence said, I don't want to keep putting the families and loved ones of my victims through this because every time it's bringing stuff up for them. Like, that's not fair. And that the sentence isn't going to go away. So as long as the sentence isn't going to go away, just do it. Let's stop putting the families and loved ones of the victims through this. And that literally became sort of the core issue of all of these different evaluations and court motions was this person telling the truth? Like, did they actually have a spiritual belief, or were they a narcissist, or were they trying to fake it so that they could just get notoriety? Were they going to mess around with the system? Like, there were all these questions, but if you look at it, if you step back, it was really this idea of if the spiritual beliefs that the person was talking about were real for them, then that made all the sense in the world. Like, yeah. If that wasn't the case, and this was being done, for example, as someone who was exhibiting signs of mental illness, then mental illness would have been a mitigating factor and it would not have proceeded. And so there were multiple different court dates, hearings, motions, filings. It went ultimately all the way up to that the Supreme Court denied to hear it, but it went all the way up to the top. And I was involved in all of the parts of that. So it was really fascinating. So I got to know all of the players. And this key idea, so my personal belief was that, yeah, this was an individual who, over time and for a variety of reasons, while having done absolutely heinous acts, and who freely admitted, had he been allowed to go out in the community, would have done them again. Like that was not in doubt whatsoever. But I also had this real sense that he actually had developed also a different sense of connection and compassion to the world. Limited because there were still, I can fairly say there was still a lot of narcissism and other things involved. That this wasn't somebody that you'd be like, hey, let's go on a date. You know, it's like not that kind of individual. But it was that sense that I talked about from first going in of this common humanity and seeing who the broader view of the person and not just defining the person by these terrible actions that he had taken. And ultimately, the decision came down from the courts that this was an individual who was competent to proceed with the sentence, and it did. Later on, years later, having nothing to do with this individual, the state no longer has the death penalty, so that's not even going to come up. But it brought for me all these conflictual issues of sort of what do I believe morally and ethically, and what do I believe as a human being, and how do we come to understand and allow ourselves to have connections with other human beings while still not condoning certain behaviors or still having really clear boundaries and saying this is okay and this isn't, and staying true to who we are, sort of without going to, like, I don't want us to be the see no evil, hear no evil kind of people, right? I want us to have a voice and to use it and to see what's neutral and what's good and what's really not okay in other people and just be able to be clear about it. So for me, it was just this huge and fascinating learning experience.
Amazing. And Christina, this was so good. Um, and we are just about to the end of our time. And quite frankly, I had expected we would be talking about your mission, your message, your book, all of the things. And here we are, not with enough time. But I think that what you shared has such an impact and really lets people see who you are. And so, do you want to, well, first of all, we're having you back. There's just no question. We have to continue the
Yay!
conversation.
Absolutely.
We've got to get to those things and also have you teach us some really amazing processes that you have developed and that you are healing the world with. So we're definitely going to have you back. And before we go, give us just take the mic and give us a little synopsis of at least your book and the work that you're doing, so that people and how people can continue the conversation with you, because I want to make sure my listeners can, in fact, be in touch.
Yay. So, really quickly, because since we have some video, the first book is Own Best Friend, 8 Steps to a Life of Purpose, Passion, and Ease, which makes me so happy. And that's really what I want everyone to do, is to be our own best friend. And truthfully, it's really soft. So, like, I do this little motion and rub it against my cheek all the time because it's super soft. And I didn't know books could be soft. And then my second book is Be Awesome, Banish Burnout, Create Motivation from the Inside Out. And there will be a third book coming. But those two really speak to, even just the titles, what my message is and what I want to do and how I want to be out engaging with people. I want to be on stages and in conferences and in conversations with people, because I truly know that when we're able to begin to practice radical self-care, that when we're able to allow ourselves to be our own best friend and to really say, wow, I'm awesome, and own our awesome, to let ourselves be that, then not only do we feel better, but the whole world gets better. And I don't have a small mission. I have a big mission. I want the world to be different. I want people to be who they are and to really be able to expand into that. So I so much appreciate having the chance to talk about this, and I can't wait to talk more. And literally, your show is just so much fun. I love listening to you, I love talking to you. And I mentioned Own Best Friend is the first book. So if you want, in fact, a free PDF copy of this, your listeners can go to bit.ly/OBF Nicole Holland. OBF for Own Best Friend, so you can keep that in mind. And so that's specifically my gift to your listeners, because what matters most to me is spreading the word that it is absolutely possible to begin to make changes in who you are and how you're living your life so that you're able to just feel better. And I know that's going to make a difference for me, for you, and for everybody else.
So generous. Thank you. And even though the PDF download, it's not something you can rub on your face softly, but it is something where you can get all of the good stuff from Kristina. Then you can go to bit.ly/OBF as in friend NICOLEHOLLAND all together. And if you're listening on the go, don't worry. Just come on over to the NicoleHollandshow.com, and on the show notes page, it will be there for you. And yeah, definitely if you want to leave a comment on the show notes page, please do. And if you want to get in touch with Kristina, again, all of everything is going to be there. You're going to have her links to all of the places she's at, including her website and social. And you can also just there's a button there. You can just click it and tweet to us. Let us know your biggest takeaway from this episode and all of the things. So,
All the
Christina,
things.
all the things.
Right.
So, for my listeners, thank you so much for listening. And I hope this was interesting for you, if nothing else, and gave you some new perspectives. And we will definitely be getting Christina back to really get into her philosophies and digging deeper into that. So thank you for listening. Christina, thank you for being here.
And thank you. Have a great day.